I said, you will never see the air this clean again, not in our lifetime, because they did so many artificial things in order to clean up the air before the Olympics. And I was like, okay, this is not going to last. And sure enough, I went back a few months later and it was dirty just like before. So what happened was in 2008, after my co-founder and I sold off our previous company, I felt that it was really time to clean up the environment for our children. That's why we started Clean Focus. At the time, we were really trying to do just project financing for solar because that was a bottleneck. If you guys remember, in 2008, during the financial crisis, car sales went down by 50% because you couldn't get financing. So the fundamental problem with clean technologies is you're taking savings or a revenue stream that goes across 20, 30 years and you're having to pay for it all up front. So you need financing, and that's a tremendously big problem. So that's how we started the company, but we quickly realized there's no such thing as a shovel-ready project, and there's no such thing as trusting a contractor to build your project. So in 2017, we acquired Green Skies here in Connecticut, and we created a vertically integrated company to essentially originate, develop, construct, finance, own, and operate solar projects. So today we have built well over 600 projects, more than 325 megawatts. That's not a lot if you compare it to a single utility scale project, but if you look at commercial and industrial, which is, we've built on top of 250 Target rooftops, Target stores. It's more than half of their stores. We built on top of 8 Amazon distribution centers. We're on top of over 100 schools in New Jersey, and we're on top of about 60% of the municipalities here in Connecticut we have built on some government building. So in terms of cumulative installations, we're probably the largest C&I developer in the United States. So sorry to drag that out, but I wanted to explain to people what has driven us to do solar.
So we were thinking, with the 3 disciplines, the financier, the developer, and then my perspective from grid and grid integration and kind of the importance of understanding those 3, that this topic can go in many ways. So we're going to kind of focus on the space of really how we can and what type of synergies we can create to really enable some of this unlocking of the queue and maybe driving some projects, to execution. So just a little bit about my background. I've been in the electric utility space for the last 20 years. The first 12 years, I was a power system engineering consultant, and my job was to gather data, build models, run studies. The last 6 years of that role, I got to have the opportunity to visit all the RTO ISOs across the states to really understand their system planning approach, their perspective, and then ultimately do the studies to determine the capability, feasibility of said generation interconnection projects. With that role, I was a road warrior. I was getting a little bit tired, so I found myself working for the local utility that I was born and raised in, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I was the senior manager of transmission planning. A little background, I started asking a lot of questions. I wanted to know where was the data, where was the models, where was the analytics to really drive and identify the needs for some of these large transmission projects that were being driven before I came. I identified there was this whole system called the distribution grid. The distribution grid is a whole space, which a lot of you that attended my talk, you can kind of hear. There is this non-visibility to understanding the true performance of that distribution grid. And really over the last 10 years, there's been an expedited race for electric utilities to build these models and to be able to be positioned to answer the questions of said developers, especially on the C&I and on the residential side. So all that to say is I then became the director of grid modernization, and as of the beginning of this year, I took on a new role where I'm really helping and supporting and driving executive advisory role in the technical strategy for grid modernization and transformation with an organization called AEIC, an acronym, Associated Edison Illuminating Companies. They've been around for 140 years. It is 185 utility members that come together and discuss all things grid, and I have this beautiful opportunity to really help support and create the cohort, the information share. Their tagline is the information of one is the information of all. So we're very good at sharing our expertise and operational challenges with each other. And my goal is to create the education, the language, and the understanding so that we can have really synergistic engagement with our external partners. So I will say I'm in a space of continuous learning, and from my experience, understanding how these projects are financed and how they are developed is almost a black box for the utility folks in regards to how they're being connected and why they're being connected. So I look forward to this conversation. So I was going to, let's go with the financier.
Okay.
So, something, maybe a softball, I don't know, might be challenging. What financing models, have proven most effective in regards to, supporting some of these clean energy projects that you have been shepherding along?
Yeah, I mean, the tax equity is still the bread and butter for our bank, both as a, literally on the tax equity side, and then sort of project finance associated with those activities. Obviously, that's been, I was supercharged in some ways, or just made more stable by the Inflation Reduction Act. So our business is growing along with the sort of stability of those tax credits. For us, I'd say this is an area of strength, but also a little bit of a constraint. The bank is very focused on serving clients in a holistic way. And so as a result, we tend to focus on really, really large developers with really, really large projects, so we can serve sort of that client from multiple perspectives. So it's providing corporate finance, providing the project finance, providing tax equity for really large utility scale projects. But increasingly, we've seen us sort of transactions move farther down the scale with some portfolios of commercial scale projects, portfolios of community scale projects as well. The sort of growth of tax credit transferability has expanded that in other ways too, which we can talk about. But that really is the core way that, from a project perspective, we're getting these projects done. We're also a very large core bank and lender to utilities. We're one of the largest utility lenders in the country. And so in many cases, our bankers are just working extremely closely with our utility partners to understand what their integrated resource plans are and multi-year development plans are. And while it's not project-specific financing, we're sort of doing a lot of bond underwriting. There's a ton of volume in the bond markets right now around utilities themselves.
So just to pull on that thread, which I don't think is a topic or a realization of all, like when you say your bank ultimately supports the utility financing, what do you mean?
I've never done the math, but it'd be a good exercise. My strong hunch is that the vast majority of the clean energy capacity that Wells Fargo is supporting the development and construction for is not project-specific finance or tax equity finance investment into a specific project. It is balance sheet general obligation loans to utilities themselves, who are developing and building out the resources they need to serve their customer base.
Thanks.
Yes.
Just like I'll just say, a couple projects I was running was this strategy, smart electric energy districts, planting green seeds across our territory to enable clean energy from the utility. And so what I found quite often working with the banks was the projects weren't big enough. So from a community level perspective, anything less than 10 million was a very challenging conversation to have with the partners that were the community members that wanted to be a part of retrofitting their buildings and then enabling solar and battery. So.
We could have a very long conversation.
Yes, that's all. I'm always want to learn more. Yeah. And it's a world that's complex and challenging as well as integrating with the grid. So I'll turn to you and kind of ask your perspective, what has your biggest technical challenges been on really unlocking and enabling some of your projects to move forward, especially as you shared earlier with your C&I folks?
So let me first kind of define how we split up the market. I mean, this is always an oversimplification, but when you look at solar, there is the residential market, so people putting solar on top of their homes and so forth. And then on the other extreme end is large-scale utility, 100, 200, 300 megawatt giant projects. When you drive in California, you see these big giant solar fields. We're in the middle, what people call commercial and industrial, which is typically around 300 to 500 kilowatts. To give you an idea, that's building on top of a Target store, on top of a Costco, or something like that. And then small utility. Small utility is typically in the 1 to 20 megawatt range. That's taking probably 6 to 60 acres of land. Okay, we're in the middle, and the middle is actually the hardest to finance. It's also hits the most technical challenges. So the technical challenges on rooftops is how long is the roof going to last? That is always a problem, because if the roof is about to go bad on you in, let's say, 5 or 10 years, you really have to wait until replacing the roof before putting on the solar. The second problem is actually net metering. So if you look at how we all use electricity, we don't use it evenly through the day, right? We tend to use it, especially as, let's say, a business, you're going to use it kind of evenly through the workday, and then at night it just falls off a cliff. But if you look at solar generation, what happens is the sun is strongest right around noontime. So if I were to plot out the curve, it's going to look like a normal distribution centered on 12 o'clock noon. So the problem is there's going to be instantaneous time points where your solar system generates more electricity than the building actually uses. Under net metering rules, what happens is whatever the solar system puts onto the grid, the owner of that system gets credits. So when solar first started, the credit was equal to what you would have paid for the solar. What's happened is, as more and more solar comes online, is that credit for putting energy onto the grid has become lower and lower, to the point now where, like in California, under what's called Net Energy Metering 3, you pretty much have to have battery storage, and batteries are very expensive. So that's become the big bottleneck in C&I is net metering. In the small utility space, it's really simple. The biggest challenge we have is interconnection. If you look at PJM, which is one of the kind of power networks in the Mid-Atlantic, the interconnection queues are 3 years, even 5 years. So when we submit an application to find out when we can interconnect a utility scale project, it could be 3 to 5 years before we find out whether we're going to be able to do it or not.
Yes, and so as a previous manager of the DER interconnection process, just some clarification. So, when we talk about solar and the development of the projects, you have your large-scale utility, which is typically connected to your transmission grid. And I just like to clarify the listeners, like on the podcast. So the transmission grid is a 3-phase balanced system that requires a significant amount of studies to be done to give the go-ahead. So some of you may be aware of the interconnection queue. Each RTO ISO, which is kind of the representation of portions of our grid from a geographical footprint, man-made, it's a membership type entity, but the utilities have a partnership with them to really be the planners, operators, and manage the markets. A lot of complexity there. But the studies to enable a generation project has to go through 3 phases, which we won't get into with the time we have, but it's each one, as it gives the go-ahead or the pass to set a developer, requires money to be put up. Then a study engineer really studies it, and we've actually had a big FERC order 2023 that really was released in the last couple months. I think it will help, but we shall see. But anyway, there's the feasibility study where you're just running load flow. Like, is the capacity on the grid exist? If it doesn't exist, what type of system upgrades would be required to continue to operate? The second is system impact, and that's where you're doing a steady state, and then you're doing a stability analysis, because the machines that we're all dependent on are running massive machines, 60 hertz. So ensuring that these new projects don't disrupt the overall frequency response and the stability of the massive grid. And then the third set of studies, you get through those 2 stages, you then get into the actual interconnection of the substation itself and the various ratings of the equipment. And then you do like a microsecond time frame snatch. And I'll just say that once you get to that level, it's pretty a go. But you could potentially, unlock another infrastructure upgrade that may put a detrimental impact to the project's financing. So that's like, from a transmission queue perspective, there is a significant amount of work. And now what's happening with all of the available solar and wind and land space, there's an enormous amount of development that wants to connect to this large grid. I don't truly have the answer to how we unlock it, but I do know that there's need to understand the data, the models, and how do we advance the current software and optimization software that we use to give us these answers. So if you think about like how to unlock it, it really comes down to the power system engineers that are sitting with this massive amount of data trying to give the go, no go. And sometimes the no-go comes down to you can connect, but it's $20 million for a transmission upgrade or 150, and that really will shut a project down. And the space you're speaking of is your distribution, C&I. So a distribution feeder, much easier to connect, hypothetically. The capacity is around 20 megawatts for a typical feed. There's been a lot of upping the standards that possibly one distribution feed could help or support 30 megawatts, but it's not very available. But to say that, the distribution interconnection process is being ran and held by each individual EDC, so electric distribution company or utility, and there's 3,000 of them. And then I'm not to talk much more, but then based on the state you're in, the regulatory and legislative law is already in print, and there's certain goes or no-goes in regards to what is allowed and not allowed, and it's typically not the utilities in the utilities' hands to change unless it's changed at the state governing legislative floor. So I think, from a developer's perspective, like having your folk in all those different states, it takes a vast amount of resources and knowledge to understand all those intricacies. So not only a technical challenge, but really an understanding of people and processes. So I said a lot there. Anything you want to counter in regards to?
Not counter, but I think what you just explained is very good evidence of why a bank like Wells tends to work with the largest, most experienced developers, because it's this upfront development risk that we're most concerned with. It's not about whether the solar panels are going to work. It's like, is the upfront investment in bringing this project into existence going to work, and how much risk is there in that development stage? And it just takes a tremendous amount of expertise to be able to navigate that process. And it also, we have a lot of, there's growing interest and growing conversations coming towards us around the bank figuring out how to get into smaller projects, serving low-income communities, more sort of bespoke projects that are sort of community scale in nature. And there's plenty of hurdles around our ability to finance those. But the number one hurdle is the sort of technical assistance and technical knowledge needed at the development level, and who are the developers who actually are going to focus on that and making sure they have the know-how to navigate that process.
Right, it's a little bit of a catch-22 too, because you may not find those key players or those key resources or developers that have that expertise until you invest in them.
Yes.
And then, so how do you know when
Yeah. I mean, this is, putting a little bit of my policy hat on. Like when I think it would be a very wise idea for governments to invest more in building out sort of local community level workforces to support the development of these kinds of projects, because I don't see it happening any other way. I mean, there's a philanthropic role there too, but you can speak to this better than I can, but it tends to not, venture capitalists don't seem to love investing in just like nuts and bolts project developers. It's pretty hard business from a VC investment return profile. So it's sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place in a lot of cases.
Exactly. So kind of like talking about all the, it is a long-term type of approach when you find these customers. So any insight or accessibility to how you find those great partners that you've been able to really drive them and connect them or together? Any successes?
So I think what you're asking is how do we originate projects, right? Or how do we go find our customers? I think my answer is it really depends on the stage of the company development. And since we are now, we're celebrating our 15th year. And so since we have a 15-year history, when we approach customers, it's very different than if I were a brand new company trying to develop projects. So we have a tremendous operating record, and we're very different than most other commercial and industrial developers because we actually own and operate our own projects. To give you an idea, the very first projects that we built in 2009 and 2010, we still own today. So what I always joke with our bankers is that we have seen everything you can imagine. Lightning strikes, catastrophic failures, manufacturing defects, you name it, hurricanes, you name it, we have seen it and we know it. And we have a saying in the company which is ... to own. So we develop to own, we construct to own, we maintain our systems because we are the owners. So when we approach our customers, our value proposition is always, you're going to work with one company from beginning to end, from now all the way through 30 years from now. We have done this before, so we're not going to make a lot of kind of novice mistakes. So that selling message most appeals to large established schools. There's a term in our industry called MUSH, municipalities, universities, schools, and hospitals. If you think about them, the MUSH tends to be very conservative. We work with real estate companies. We work with large box stores. So as an example, we're building 54, on top of 54 Lowe's stores in California right now. So we have a kind of an RFP response team that responds to all the government RFPs, and we also have a sales team that goes out and talks to the real estate companies, the corporations, and so forth.
And I guess I just want to share the idea that you just shared, that you guys ultimately develop and then own and operate, is what is needed. So from a utilities perspective, what they've been through and what we have been through over the decades is this flipping of sites. Where we have real estate developers that really prepare the site and then pass the baton. And so you're getting shuffled amongst many different individuals, and really there's no true ownership or care or really ability to hold them accountable to the product and the connection in itself. So when you're an operator of a grid, especially in the transmission space, there is a certain requirement, especially for our large bulk generation fleets, that there's mandates and there's even penalization. And if you are not there when you are called upon, there is repercussions. When you get into solar, which is an inverter-based resource, which fundamentally rolls up to wind, solar, battery, and anything that connects with that inverter base, there's this passing of the baton business that happens that really creates distrust of the utility to truly believe that these assets that are generating will be there when they're being asked to be there. And so having that full ownership suite and all of that experience is incredibly valuable. And so I would say an awesome opportunity is if we can create more of that inertia, no pun intended. But that could keep the discussions and the viability of these projects a little bit more, the stakes are kind of grounded. Because I've seen, and I've been in a lot of workshops where after the developers come and turn online, then they get into these commercial and these what is reliable, and then they find that their inverters have a certain set of conditions that weren't wrote in the standards. So there's this whole fleet of technical challenges that can pop up the whole way, and especially during operations. So that's really key, and I think that's awesome that you guys are doing that. There is a lot of uncertainty in these projects, and I think you may have talked about it a little bit, but anything that you've best case use cases or case studies where, you've been able to funnel out that uncertainty and really drive projects forward. And I know you say you work with the large utilities, and I guess I'll peel on that onion. So not all utilities can own and operate generation, but they are required to build and develop and operate the infrastructure to connect the generation.
Yes.
So are you supporting, helping both sides?
Yeah, both sides, fully integrated, deregulated, muni. We have large business supporting municipal utilities, co-op utilities, so it's kind of every flavor of that. But for us, when it comes to projects, the bankability of the PPA is really the thing that matters most if we're talking about individual projects and who the off-taker is. And that being a really solid credit is foundational to how these come together. One notable recent transaction we did was this mega project in the Southwest with Pattern Energy, this very long high voltage transmission line attached to renewable resources.
I studied that line.
Oh yeah. It's been in development for a long time. It's I can't remember the total ticket size of it, but it's the largest clean infrastructure project in American history. And we were like a lead green structuring agent because a lot of it is funded through green bonds supporting the project. I mean, that takes over a year for us to figure about developing the project. It takes over a year for the finance side to figure out how to execute that transaction, and the number of contracts. I mean, literally going back to like Dan Gross's finance class here, like you see this circle of like contracts that have to be in place around these kinds of projects and maintenance and offtake and interconnection agreements. You have to get every single one of those to line up before you can execute that kind of a transaction. It's hard. Again, it's hard. And so especially for a bank like us, like risk mitigation is the number one priority for these kinds of transactions. And so we're not going to move unless sort of every element of that is in place, which can take a long time in these really big projects.
I feel like I want to ask you another question. So here, it's really hard. It's complicated. A lot of contracts need to be signed. Like, what's some words of wisdom to maybe someone out here that has this incredibly great idea or found a particular part of the grid that really can unlock an extreme value? How do they approach it?
I think figuring out, this is what I'm trying to get done. So this is my ask to all of you. How to develop business models that are focused on aggregating resources that a bank like Wells can lend against at sort of like a warehouse scale. Because we're not going to do individual project by project that are, half a megawatt or something at the scale you're working at. I mean, it's you aggregate it. That's how you make it work from the finance side. That's what you're doing. And I think that's a huge opportunity right now in this market for developers to build up that track record, build up the pipeline, and build portfolios of smaller projects that are added together. I actually think Bush market is a really good market to look at right now. The direct pay tax credits coming out of the IRA in some ways make that even easier. You need those customers to like first understand what direct pay is and figure out how to file a tax return, which they've never done before. But once they get over that, which will happen, I think it's a really large opportunity tends to be like a set of clients that ultimately a bank like Wells is very comfortable with, because if it's universities and hospitals, those are clients of the bank already. There are harder, I'll put it this way, there's harder categories of projects than those. And so I think that's an opportunity where I think there's a lot of green space for developers to figure out how to do that efficiently and build up pipelines that really can meet banks' needs like Wells Fargo.
So I heard you mention that in your full stream, you also do financing for
Yes,
these
we do.
projects. So what was the realization, and how did you build up to that? I mean, that this is something that we need to do. Is it because the banks, you're the middle-sized, or?
So it's exactly as Jeff said. No bank is going to finance a tiny project, so you have to aggregate it and you have to create funds. So our original idea was, it's very similar to real estate. If you think about real estate development, if you're an institutional investor and somebody comes to you and says, I have a parking lot, where you have a lot of good revenue, you don't really have to do anything. If you say you have one parking lot, they're not really interested. If you go to them and say, I have 50 parking lots, they become very interested because you have scale. All right. It's very similar in solar. We realized many years ago that you have to aggregate a large enough bundle before institutional investors are going to be interested. The difficulty is, how do you do that aggregation? And the answer is, you have to, it's a chicken or the egg problem, because we have to have a very large development pipeline that can fill a fund. So what we do is we go out and we raise $50, $100 million funds where we can drop in the project. And to give you an idea of the challenge, if we build on top of a Target store, it's probably around 500 kilowatts. Even when you look at fair market value, not the actual cost of the system, let's say it's $3, that's a $1.5 million fair market value. To a bank like Wells Fargo, that's like, I'm not interested. Okay. So what we have to do is create this $50 to $100 million fund, and then we have to drop these projects in as we get them built, and then we aggregate it. So right now we have 3 about to create a 4th fund that we operate simultaneously. And the reason is for ground mounts, for carports, for different parts of the country with different cash flow patterns. The way we optimize the financing is very different. So we cannot use a single fund to do everything. We have to use multiple funds. So the idea is we aggregate these funds, and then sometime in the future when it becomes a very large pool, we've gone through the 5-year ITC recapture period, we can probably aggregate them again and then do securitization or other forms of financing. But in the interim, it's very painful work. When we go out and we develop a project, one of the first things we have to consider is how are we going to finance it? So you have to look at the whole, kind of the whole life cycle before even getting started.
I want to play a little bit kind of a story. So, working for the utility, and you said parking lot, and this is what made me think of it. And so my idea was, I was overseeing the enablement of these new technologies. And being in Western Pennsylvania, there really isn't any drive or mandates or regulatory numbers to unlock clean energy. However, I found myself crafting really the language and the discussion with my executive leadership on the importance of understanding how all of these different systems will interact with the grid and developing that expertise so that we can become the energy advisors to those that want to connect with the grid. And it all came together. There was an empty parking lot where an old civic arena, hockey stadium used to sit, and it was barren for about 10 years. It was a part of a community, very entangled. And I thought they're going to build this plan from the ground up. So it was a net zero pitch, which was working with all of the developers to show them the cost and the cost benefit of deploying solar, battery, and then really a site of, big dreams. But what I found in that discussion, and I learned so much, was one, the developers were not based in our city. And they had very narrow margins to meet. But I kept penciling out the net metering benefits, which in the state of PA was actually quite lucrative. It's one of the best retail rate that you can get, ironically, even though no one's actually deploying at scale solar. They are, but not rampant like other states. And all that to say, it came down, and I remember having I would show up on these Zoom calls. It was during COVID, and I was bushy tailed and happy, developers, we're going to create the first net zero. It's a seed, and all of the numbers in my mind pencil out. Then I learned about financing a bit. But all to say, I remember the gentleman, he just finally said, no. They're not going to hear you, Elizabeth, right? From a financial perspective. But I will say a victory. They built their parking garage and multiple buildings with capacity in their building to hook up inverters in the future. So it was a slight win.
Solar ready.
Solar ready and battery backup storage ready. So then they didn't even share that with me after the fact. But it was such an interesting discussion on a continuous basis of one, what was the utilities driver was really to help understand what the other drivers were. So when they come to the table. And what ultimately we learned through that whole strategy process, and we actually went on to other partners to do this, but not really this parking stuff, is how challenging the financing is and to getting the right language in the right room to finally get those box checked. And so it really didn't come down to the technology feasibility. So that was a big takeaway for me, that this became more of a understanding the processes that are at stake that will be bucked and the systems that will have to change, and then getting the right champions of change to really help support a lot of those projects. So if it's coming from the developer, the financiers, and the utility, I think there's a beautiful space that really we can expedite a lot of these projects. But it's really the understanding of the technical challenges for the patients. But a lot of us are under and I guess I'm going to throw it to your way, from a time frame of investment and rate of your return, right? I got a lot of those. Utilities moved a little bit slowly. Interconnection is slow. So any food for thought in regards to the timeframes of what investors want and banks want versus how the actual projects roll out?
I think banks can be a little bit more patient than people realize. Like they'll move quickly when the opportunity's there, but they're also perfectly content to wait until something comes along that fits. The bank overall, the loans we make are relatively short term, which is something that surprised me when I came. Like a typical corporate loan is 3 years, something like that. Our project financing is longer, but not that much longer. And when we're tax equity investors, the flip structures are what they are, and so 7-10 years, sort of in that range. But I think the terms and the patience sort of line up pretty well, strangely, between the banking and the utility and clean energy space overall. This is a little bit of just a challenge for all American banks. It's just American regulatory structures make it harder for American banks to do like really long-term tenor project finance. Like 15-year loans we could do it, but they're really hard and sort of expensive from a capital perspective, which is why we tend to see, or part of why we see European banks have such a large role in project finance here in the U.S. But I think overall, we have hurdle rates and we have sort of return requirements that are, we're one of the largest commercial banks in the country. We're competitive, but not sort of excessive in that space. We can't be because we have such hard competition from our peers. So I think strangely there's like a pretty good alignment of like risk return and sort of like tenor profile in a lot of these projects and a lot of this activity with where sort of large commercial banks are.
Okay. Can we open up to the audience? So we have some time. We would like to, anyone have any questions or thoughts that maybe popped up while we were talking? Go ahead.
So you mentioned, my question is for John. You mentioned that there are bottlenecks when it comes to financing projects, largely because of some of the net metering rules that are in place for solar programs. I think you cited California. Sorry.
I think you cited California as an example. My question is kind of two parts, and as Dr. Cook mentioned, all of the utilities are really bound by the state regulators as to like what they can and cannot do. So the first question is, are there states that you almost prefer to work in because they have a little bit more robust regulations when it comes to solar production, like incentives programs? And then the second part is, what are your thoughts on Connecticut's NRES program, where they have the traditional netting tariff where the solar is interconnected to the building, they use the solar directly, and then the excess is credited. But then they also have the buy-all tariff program where there's no interconnection to the building, and instead all of the electricity is sold to the utility. Should other states kind of mirror what Connecticut's doing? Just kind of wanted to know your thoughts there.
So let me paraphrase the two questions for everyone who didn't hear the first. I think the first part of the question is, are there regions, locations that are particularly favorable, right? And then the second is to comment on Connecticut NRES program. So in terms of favorability, at the end of the day, energy is a highly regulated industry. For anyone who wants to start a company and get venture capital funding, a tip: do not go into regulated industries, unless it's something like healthcare, where it is so huge. So regulated industries means that by definition, when we're doing energy, we're going to be constrained by all the regulations of not just that state, but also the very, very like the city, the utility that's in that city, and so on and so forth. The other thing that we really have to consider is the incentives. The truth of the matter is there's a very limited number of places in the United States, primarily California, where your electricity rate is really high, where there's enough sunlight, where even if I built solar with no incentives, in certain locations I could make it, the financial term is I can make it pencil, I can make it economically viable. But in most parts of the country, that just doesn't work. You have to have some sort of local incentive in addition to all the federal incentives. So going back to the question, we like the Northeast, Massachusetts, New Jersey, obviously Connecticut, that's why we're based here. And I'd say the Mid-Atlantic is becoming more interesting, Maryland, Pennsylvania. and some parts of the Midwest like Illinois, and obviously California. California is unique because it's huge, very, very high electricity rates. For those of you who are not familiar with it, the electricity rates can be like 45 cents per kilowatt hour for homeowners, okay? That's like double what we pay here in Connecticut. And California also has fantastic sunlight. People don't realize it, but Germany used to be the leader in solar deployment maybe 10, 15 years ago. California gets twice the amount of sunlight as Germany. So I think that's kind of the answer to the first question. The problem, though, is that as solar becomes a larger and larger percentage of your energy mix, the utilities claim 5%, other people claim 20%, but something in that range, your grid starts to become unstable. And so what happens is utilities, even though they are, quote, under the regulation of, the regulators, they will start to push back and influence those regulators. And so what happened in California is we went from NIM 1 to NIM 2 to NIM 3, and NIM 3 really sucks for solar. You got to have battery storage. Going to the second part of your question about NRES in Connecticut, we love the NRES program. There's two parts of the program. There's what's called the netting or the buy-all. The netting is essentially, simplistically describing it, is it's behind the meter, meaning that we feed the electricity to the building consumes it, and we get an incentive on top of whatever the building pays us. The buy-all is essentially, it's a feed-in tariff. We install on the building, but instead of selling it to the building, we sell it to the grid at a fixed feed-in tariff rate. Physically, okay, electronically, the electrons are going from our system into that building. All right. Program is great. We love it. It is a bidding mechanism, so we have won. In fact, in the last bid, I think we won about 45% of total capacity. So we did pretty well in it, and it shows that we really understand Connecticut.
Just want to play with the California grid. So, they, with NEM 1, it really scaled. And because the prices were so high, it was penciling out. And so California makes enough energy that they are selling it for the negative dollar into the states next to them. So there's a whole energy market phenomena that we need to play with. And so it's very complex. And then also, when you think about there's like a rule that one of the labs created. 15% capacity of solar on a distribution circuit will cause adverse effects. That rule was a rule of thumb, and not until utilities actually built their circuit models, which just started happening the last 10 years, could we really quantify it. And what we're seeing is every circuit is a fingerprint. So every interconnection could be vastly different to the neighbor next door. So every interconnection to every circuit will show up differently. So it could be 5 to 20%, and sometimes you could have a 30% penetration of your solar onto a feeder and have no impact. So it becomes really challenging to especially to communicate to the masses of how complex those decision-making powers are to be. And then also, when you inject electrons in the opposite direction of what it was designed on, your voltage regulation and the health of the actual feeder that serves all customers that have no solar comes into focus. And those that are held and required to perform a strong voltage source have to roll trucks, retune the reactors, change their taps on the transformers, and really reassess the full design that it originally was. So there's a lot of complexities that happen when that starts happening. So that synergies of really gathering the data, building the models, and being able to have that partnership conversation with the developers is something that was not available. And I think there's a true space where that will now become more open and transparent because it is available and we can have more minds studying it. But I just wanted to share, California ultimately proliferated so much solar that they have to dump it, shut it off. And so therefore that really causes a complex problem. And so I say, let's not do that to the rest of the grids across the states and think about really that full picture. And I think NEM 3 was really because of the detriment of all of the connections to the overall performance. So we had to make a change. I know it, yep.
Thank you. My question is more towards Jeff. I'm curious, you mentioned banks having a preference for larger, more mature, established developers, but it seems like an interest and desire in more nuanced projects that have low-income focuses. What do you see the role of sort of traditional private capital markets being in meeting the private capital mobilization goals of programs like the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund?
Yeah, it's really hard. I'll be honest. It's a challenge, and I think there needs to be like a really honest and really focused conversation on what that actually means to try to serve low-income households and what the best models for that really are. I think right now we're at a moment of rightfully a lot of excitement and a lot of creativity around what those business models are, and but I think sort of getting to a lot of what we talked about, like at some point you gotta actually say like, what is it you're building and what's the credit? And then a financial institution will have a conversation and be like, okay, now I know what we're talking about. Let's see how we can finance this. Right now we're at a stage where I think I'm in a lot of conversations where developers or GGRF recipients are like, hey, let's have a conversation about community-owned projects. I'm just like, okay, but what are you talking about? Like, we got to be really specific. Is it solar? Is it storage? Where is it being built? Who's the offtake? What's the credit? Who's building it? And so I don't want to like dampen enthusiasm around the opportunities there because I think they're real. But I do think that if we really want to build connection between those projects and scale up from capital, all of a sudden, like eventually reach scales of having banks like Wells Fargo financing it. One, I think there's got to be a little bit of recognition of the amount of time it takes to build that sort of ecosystem of an evolution to get to that scale, but also be really thoughtful on the front end of what do we want to try to build to begin with. I'm on the board of a nonprofit that focuses on low-income community solar, and I've been a part of that for almost a decade now, and it's excruciatingly hard to actually put up, you want to build rooftop solar in a low-income community that's on the roof of a nonprofit that's serving low-income subscribers, like that's laborious, to put it mildly, and really hard to finance. And so I think there's absolutely a role for private capital, but it takes, one thing I'll say that I've also learned since being here is complex capital stacks with sort of guarantees, subordinated debt, risk and credit enhancements. Sometimes they can unlock private capital and really work. Sometimes they actually turn out to make things even more complicated. And there's no silver bullet to that. That just requires dialogue. And so I think, I guess my one piece of advice was like that developers should be like really thoughtful about being specific, and sort of NGOs and community groups should be really thoughtful about being really specific about what they actually want to build and for whom and where. But then have a lot of dialogue with lenders. And I would also encourage folks in that space to come to capital providers being totally honest and ask for them to be totally honest. Sometimes we're in conversations where I can sort of tell like folks are dancing around the reality of like what we're talking here really won't work, but this will. I think getting through that phase of discussion to like, all right, let's just be clear about what actually you will do here will help the whole ecosystem move towards what ultimately I think is bankable and can scale. I know there's a lot of excitement right now because there's a lot of money out there and a lot of attention in this space, but it's really, really hard. And so I think having some like collective honesty in these ecosystem around what's plausible will probably get us to success more quickly.
I know we're coming up on time, but I just want to give a plug for, when we think about what happened during the New Deal, 1930s, the whole idea was let's create jobs and economies and opportunity for rural America, right? So we electrified rural America. I just want to give like the IIJA, the CHIP, and then also IRA. I know those are acronyms, then I think we might all know what they are. If you read what the funding opportunities are and how they're defining a proposal that could win, really does support and help this idea of how do we create project solutions to advance these new technologies and ensure that we're keeping all in the focus and not just some. And so I think, there's a lot of great projects and opportunities that are kind of trickling out of that funding. I really advise, grab a hold of it, read it, and see like all of the various projects that are winning the money, and like read the content of behind the money, and you'll start seeing that these discussions around, areas of our grid that haven't always been served, are now, there's many conversations happening across the utility space, let alone all of the areas of developers and technologies and those that want to partner and drive these projects are focusing on how to like effectively have these types of projects become more concrete. And then, of course, there's going to be some regulatory and oversight of how you spend it, but really the money is there to really try to champion it because we really don't have a lot of that money available to those projects. So, any last words before we wrap it up for the audience? I don't see any hands. Because I know we're over time. We're at 2 o'clock, right?
No, you have a little more time.
Oh, okay. I thought we were due.
Any more questions?
Yeah, do you have any more questions? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jocelyn. I'm from Ecuador, South America, and I'm now part of the Clean Energy Financing and Deploying Certificate Program. And I'm working on actually connecting capital for small, medium-sized C&I solar projects. And I'm also sharing the challenge of getting access to capital because on the financing side, maybe the tickets are smaller. I would like to understand what's the complexity behind project finance for small projects. What is impossible? Because at the end, is the same methodology for a larger project that for a smaller one, or what's behind that stops?
Like, why is it hard?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give my answer. You might have a different one. I mean, the simplest way to think about it is the amount of time that it takes to underwrite a small project. If you're a bank, the number of people and the number of hours you have to devote to underwriting a small project is kind of the same as a large project. It's not quite true, but like that's effectively a fixed cost of underwriting a project. And so you have an upfront fixed cost of evaluating and underwriting a project. And so you're going to get a higher return if it's on that fixed cost if it's a large project that's generating more revenue. And so there's sort of perpetually a desire to look at larger projects because you get more return on the sort of the human cost of underwriting it. Part of it is also, and this is something I've seen, is just as all of these projects just get bigger and bigger, the ticket sizes of the projects that the bank is financing is also just getting bigger and bigger. And we're large, but we're not like infinitely large. And so more and more of our own capital and bandwidth is being taken up by larger and larger projects just because so many things we're doing are now over $1 billion. And so there's just capital constraints beyond the sort of the return economics. Now, does that sort of match with how you would characterize it?
It does. I would add that fundamentally it comes down to greed.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. This is all about just making
So-
money. Don't be like.
How do we create a system where that is not the driver?
No, what I mean by that is at the end of the day, it's all about people. So if you go to a bank, there's a limited number of people, and they're going to do what makes them the most money. And if you're a very large bank, you have a huge amount of money to deploy. You have to deploy it into really big projects because that's the only way to move all that money with the limited number of manpower that you have. Okay, so we do not deal with any of the bulge banks. So JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, Citibank, and so forth. We do not do business with them. We work almost exclusively with regional banks. And the reasons regional banks are smaller, they are more used to lending commercially, residential, and so forth. So they're used to smaller ticket sizes. Their compensation structures and everything are better suited for what we need to do. And so for them, a $50 million fund is interesting, while for Wells Fargo, it's like if it's not $100 million, they don't even want to think about it. So that's what I mean by, at the end of the day, you have to just look at the motivations of people, and that's fundamentally what is going on. Now, practically, exactly as Jeff said, there's a huge amount of transaction costs. So when we set up a fund it costs us literally hundreds of thousands of dollars to set up that fund, legal fees, due diligence, all that kind of stuff. And then as every project comes in, we still have to do a certain amount of legal and technical due diligence on each of those projects. But because the fund is set up, we can reduce the transaction cost for each one of those projects down to a more manageable amount. And then we drop them into the funds. But when I say that it sounds easy, it's still very painful.
I guess it hasn't come up yet, but there's something happening in our space around data centers. Is anyone hearing about those energy users? And I just maybe food for thought, and really kind of from a financial follow the money perspective, and how do we create or develop big thinkers to drive kind of to understand why. And so something that I've noticed is a big concentration and a large request of utilities 5 years ago. So this is like how quick this stuff is happening, is electric, heavy duty, medium duty trucking, charging infrastructure. And so when we were talking about charging those large, massive trucks, like if you check into Volvo and Daimler, they have actually reinvented, put manufacturing in the States, driving the whole construction of these massive Mack trucks electrified. It's happening, it's here, and the number one hurdle is capacity to the grid. They need the 20, 30, 40 megawatt charging infrastructure connected to the interstates. There's a big amount of money that could be made, really, but what are the drivers of the true drivers of converting the fuel? I'll just leave it there. Here comes data centers where they've had their heyday asking utilities for their 10, 20, 100, 200 megawatt loads overnight. And we're talking construct and connect me within a year. And now they're asking the utility industry for 1,000, 1,500. That is the size, the peak load of the city of Pittsburgh is 2,800 megawatts. They're resourcing large generation plants just to serve these data centers. And I only share this story from a perspective of follow the money, is like it's an $800 billion industry of these data centers. And those that are driving the selection of these sites to build out the projects are choosing states that have low cost energy and land. However, you think about what is data storage, it needs a lot of water, it needs a lot of energy, and it actually shouldn't probably be in the hottest environments. So there's like this huge dynamic of asking the utilities to like pivot. And we have been delivering, but there is not enough generation capacity to serve this data center drive. So I guess I just want to, from a follow the money and then the perspective of like, how can we create solutions that will require many partnerships from many bright minds to really construct like the process and really create the plan to enable not only data center drive, and we can't forget about the solar development, the charging infrastructure development, as well as all of the other new technologies that are clean resourced. It's an epidemic. So I'll just say the data center conversation, it was hydrogen 3 years ago, and now it's data centers in almost every utility industry conference. So anyone sitting in the seats with the big ideas, bright minds, understanding what is that positioning, I think could really unlock a lot of opportunity and really create a partnership with the utility, because I think we're seeking to understand how we can deliver.
Yeah, and just to add on that, we're a massive commercial real estate lender, energy lender. We have a lot of folks internally working on this exact intersection. And so I agree it is a big opportunity. And also just sort of anecdotally, I was at an event during Climate Week in New York a couple weeks ago, and it happened to be the CSO, the chief sustainability officers of 3 of the largest utilities in the country. And sort of the prompt to the group was like, what keeps you up at night? And all 3 of them said the exact same thing, which is like, this is like specifically the convergence of like an explosion of like demand almost overnight with their own clean energy goals. It's like how, you're sort of in some ways between a rock and a hard place of how do you keep moving in the right direction on the clean energy while serving sort of addressing the technical challenges of the surge in demand from data centers.
The irony is data. give us data.
Right.
Then we need
The
those
answer is
data.
data.
Yes. Any other questions? Yep.
Thank you. This has been a great conversation. So I have a question more for the big projects side of things, as well as the utilities. We've been hearing a lot in the venture space, the startup space, about people are excited about nuclear again, but speaking of things that require huge upfront investment, I think it'd be hard to find something that requires more. So I'm wondering what the big banks are thinking of. Is it on your radar? And putting aside the policy and regulatory concerns, are the utilities, are the big banks sort of thinking at all about a potential uptick in nuclear deployment, or is that just not something to think about at all?
It's definitely very much on our radar and something we're paying a lot of attention to. We happen to have a utility client base. I think the fuel mix of our utility clients leans strangely very heavy to nuclear, and so we actually have a lot of familiarity with the technology. How that ends up getting financed, like the idea that banks on their own are going to start financing large-scale nuclear projects again, that seems kind of implausible. There's corporate scale finance, which is a little bit different. But the last nuclear project to be built in America was financed by the U.S. Department of Energy, and that might happen again. That seems possible to me. The first sort of or SMR projects or small modular reactors are being built in pilot stage now. But there has been this sort of strange swing in the last year or so where I think everyone's like, it's all SMRs and big nuclear is dead, and it feels like literally in a matter of months, it's been swing way back in the other direction. And to your point, a little bit about or as an observation, there's been a lot of investment in manufacturing capacity in places like Georgia, where a lot of the companies building that manufacturing capacity want access to 24/7 clean energy baseload. Lo and behold, you have a new nuclear plant. And so there's an interesting political dynamic to that all of a sudden Governor Kemp can be like, oh, this is great having nuclear because we're now attracting certain kinds of clean tech manufacturing that who would have thought it would sort of happen there at all. So I do think it's going to happen, but I don't have a really clear prediction of how it's going to get financed, because the notion that it's going to be purely through commercial means seems kind of implausible to me, given the almost 100% certainty of cost overruns of those kinds of projects.
They're negotiating opening old nuclear plants.
Yeah.
Which are happening as real. And I will say small nuclear, modular reactors, they're not truly small. Right. I think I always find that, we're talking, many megawatts, but they are also hot on the tail of this data center discussion.
Very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So a few things. I hope you can see and assess from this conversation why everyone took stock at Yale and said we cannot teach this because it's evolving too rapidly. The level of expertise that you need from different sectors and approaches is in the field and from practitioners and has to be brought back in for then us to consider, respond to, research, and learn from. And two, if you have a joke about a grid expert, a developer, or a financier that comes out of this, tell Elizabeth and she may share it on her podcast, okay? But thanks so much. Really appreciate you all being here. It's been great. You got to step up, kid? Yeah. So this is the 60% of technology that we already have, right? Depending on your estimate. What do we need to develop? What do we need to finance? What do we need to deploy? Where do we get the other 35, 40%? And what are the places and sources for that? Well, that's something that we've been working on in and around this community, in the region, in New Haven, in Connecticut, and through the university. And we know that also that's not something you can do in-house. And you have to create spaces and spots where that can happen. And the place that a lot of us around the region have invested in is Climate Haven, a new climate tech incubator in the city of New Haven, in downtown New Haven, that's going to celebrate its year-long anniversary on November 14th, but has been in development for really 2 years. And over the first 2 years, with the board and community members and a range and a first CEO, we went through incredible growth and development. And now we're thrilled to have the kind of next stage of growth and development led by a new CEO, Justine Lee. And Justine, I'll give a little story about when I knew I was deeply excited about working more with Justine, is that she came here and was one of the judges for the Yale Innovation Summit pitch contest in our climate pitches. And we were talking on the phone in a prior session, and I was like, hey, so, we're going to do the judging, and directly after the judging, there's going to be another set of pitches from climate tech companies, and we're going to have our conversation. I couldn't get the words out of my mouth before Justine was like, no, I want to see all the other pitches from all the entrepreneurs. I need to see the ideas. I really want to understand what they're working on, and I'm deeply invested in kind of learning about those. And I was just like, wow, that is the exact type of response. And Justine in her career has built really complex, amazing infrastructure and things, city bikes in New York. She's invested in climate tech companies. She's mentored early stage startups. And now she's here to help work with all of us and inspire our crew. So